Our first presenter during our science session is Dana Allen. Dana has been working on stormwater and water quality for a number of years in the Champlain Valley. He was working with the Watershed Consulting Associates when I first saw a presentation of his work. He has since moved on with research and a master thesis at UVM, which has focused on water quality impacts. He's a principal of FluidState Consulting and lives in Vermont. So I'd like to welcome up here Dana Allen, please.
Hello? Oh, look at that. Perfect. All right, thanks. So first off, thanks, Chris, for having me at this conference. This is by far the most formal, set up, most produced conference I've ever presented at, so I'm freaking out. Also, my co-presenter, Becky Tharp, Dr. Becky Tharp, couldn't be here today, and she covers a lot of this, like I would say the lion's share of this, because she's smarter than I am, she has a doctorate, so there's this whole nerd factor that she brings that I can't bring. So I'll do my best. I know the material pretty well. All right, let me find all my controls here. So with that said, today we're going to be talking about de-icing storage as a potential salt point source. Often when we talk about salt pollution or salt impacts, we're talking about roads, we're talking about parking lots. Those are diffuse, spatially distributed, ephemeral sources of things like chloride and sodium. Today we're talking about a salt shed, essentially, or a couple of salt sheds, and we'll give you some context for that. Now, we did have this really fancy, this is where I nerd out. I'm a geographer by training and a water scientist by accident. And so we had this really cool story map and dashboard. We had all kinds of zoomy features and dynamic content and that sort of thing. We can't show that today. But I just wanted to highlight that I created that as a geography nerd to get a little bit of extra credit. So we did some screen grabs instead from that. I've been told that you guys can see the laser pointer. Maybe you can't. Where is it? No one can really see the laser pointer, so moot point. This is the site context. So what we're looking at here is a couple of large salt sheds in the Champlain Valley, Vermont, near Shelburne, Vermont, south of Burlington, on the La Platte River, which drains to Lake Champlain. So you see those two big salt sheds in the center there, those white sheds. Notice we have those blue points around them. You'll notice the control point to the north. That's a relatively unimpacted watershed that's roughly the same size as the salt shed watershed. We have our pond outlets. And then we have a couple other points down to the south there. There's a seep, so essentially a groundwater seep coming out of this sandy plateau that seeps into the river. And then we used to monitor the river itself directly. So we have a couple different monitoring points there. Notice that big green blob. That big green blob is a Class 1 wetland. Class 1 wetlands in Vermont are special wetlands. There's only 9 or 10 of them currently. And so they're wetlands of special concern because they're big, they're contiguous, they provide a lot of water quality benefit. And notice that this salt shed facility is right on the border of that wetland. Also of note, in orange to the north, and then also a little bit to the south, obscured by a label, we have a couple of monitoring points. That's Vermont DEC's monitoring points for chloride. So they've been monitoring those areas for chloride. Those monitoring points were adopted by this facility as their jurisdictional monitoring points. And that's important. We'll talk about that again in a second. So let's zoom in a little bit. So again, those two sheds. Notice we have the pond outlet. What was I going to talk about here? Right. Yeah, so notice we have that pond outlet right there to the north. You can see the stormwater pond just to the north of that second shed. That's where the majority of the drainage for this site goes. And then we also have that seep point at the bottom. So that's what we want to highlight in this. Let's also note that what's being stored on this site is rock salt, so sodium chloride, not magnesium chloride, potassium chloride, et cetera. That's primarily what's being stored here is rock salt. The other thing I wanted to point out is that to the south of this site, you kind of see coming in on the southern edge of the property what's a rail spur. So essentially salt comes in off that rail, goes in on the rail spur, pulls up next to the shed to the south. There's that little roof structure, the white roof structure to the north of the large red dot. That's the salt offloading pit area. So cars pull up to that. Salt gets taken out of the cars, put onto trucks. Trucks take it into the sheds. This is important for two reasons. One, rail ballast is pervious, so it allows water and other things into the ground. And two, no matter what, when you're moving material, you're probably spilling material. So some amount of material spillage is inevitable in this situation. So you're getting tracking and things like that in this entire area. So remember, rail ballast is pervious, tracking happens. Let's see, yeah, so again, just wanted to show that pond. That's where most of the drainage for this site goes. It's a typical stormwater pond. We're not talking about a gravel wetland. It's not a filter. There's nothing like that. Again, those state monitoring points, so to the north, that's about 1 kilometer downstream of the site, so fairly far away on the main stem of the river. And then the other one is probably about 0.5 kilometer upstream of that site. So just keep in mind that there's a lot of river between where those sheds are and where that saltwater pond discharges to the wetland and where the state is monitoring results. And then the other thing I wanted to show you is this giant watershed here. We have a fairly large watershed. Basically, you can see where it says Shelburne. Just to the north of that, you see those little white dots. That's where the sheds are. And so those two state monitoring points are in the main stem of the river, essentially at the mouth of this watershed, which is large. So what do we know about pollution? Dilution is the solution. And there's a lot of dilution coming down that river. So keep that in mind as we move forward here. So we did an original study in 1819 and published the results of that study, but the goal of that study was to determine if the modeling and the monitoring by this transload facility, Shelburne transload facility, adequately characterized the impact of the Class 1 wetland along the La Platte River. So what we wanted to do is identify points of discharge from the STF and then reference zones in that Class 1 wetland, so control areas. We wanted to monitor water continuously, so we used conductivity as a proxy for chloride, basically electrical conductance through water, which increases with salt load. We also sampled soils for salts at the discharge points, looking for impacts there to soil and vegetation. You can read all the details in this study. We won't go into all of that today. We don't have that time. And then we did post-publication monitoring from 2020 to 2023. And so what we wanted to see there is, are we still seeing the same impacts that we saw in that initial study through 18 and 19? And we also wanted to try and characterize the influence of road salt on soils and its movement through the wetland. And as you'll see from our results, we had not great results at figuring that out, turns out. So we're gonna go through these results. We've got some water grab samples to show you that continuous water monitoring using our conductivity as a proxy for chloride concentration, and then our soils and vegetation results. And so first off here, what we've got let's see, I'm so dyslexic. Let's see, we've got on the left-hand side, the results from 2018, 2019. Those are water grab samples from our control site, which is all the way on the left, the seep, which is in the middle, and keep in mind this seep is a proxy for what's going into the ground. It's a groundwater proxy. Essentially, we're sampling water that's leaching out at the toe of a slope off this sandy plateau, hits a clay layer, goes into the river. So we're sampling that for chloride, and then the pond outlet, which is essentially anything coming out of that stormwater pond. So what we're seeing, and again, 2020 to 2023 is over on the right-hand side, what we're seeing is our control site. Remember that watershed to the north that's relatively unimpacted? Pretty low, not super concerned. Note we have the two standards, chloride standards, the EPA chloride standards of 230 milligrams per liter and 860 milligrams per liter of chloride as the orange and red lines there. So you can see the control site is always below that. In 1819, SEEP was quite high, exceeding the acute standard of 860 milligrams per liter several times, and always being above the chronic standard. 2020, 2023, it reduces somewhat. We think this is due to changes in management practice on the site, and we'll get into that a little bit later with the site's own monitoring data, but it does reduce. However, it never falls below the chronic standard. So if we're looking at this from a jurisdictional standpoint, at these monitoring points, they're not in compliance. The same thing happens with the pond outlet. We're looking at that chronic standard along the bottom. The pattern remains quite consistent over these grab samples. We still have exceedance 18 through 2023. So the results are very consistent as far as this goes, which indicates that that stormwater pond, which is catching all of this drainage and treating the stormwater runoff, isn't really doing a whole lot for chloride. Go. Okay. I mentioned that they do their own monitoring. So this plan actually shows a number of monitoring wells. You can see them in those little black and white circular markers. They have their own groundwater monitoring wells where they do some level of grab sampling and continuous monitoring. We'll look at those results in a second, but in particular, I'd like you to notice that, see that rail spur on the south, and then there's that offloading pit there. There's kind of like a roof, and there's a monitoring well right next to it, just to the west, 306A. Keep that in mind, 306A. That is also very near our seep site. So 306A and our seep are essentially grabbing the same water from groundwater. And so what we see is that these are all of their monitoring wells. You can see the sites up there, MW numbered. You can see the key there. We're kind of flying through this, but notice the one that's of concern, that 306A. Remember, our seep site was super high with chloride, again, over the chronic standard, that orange line, flirting with the acute standard at times. 306A, which is in geographic proximity to that, pretty much the same boat, pretty high, and was that way for several years. I forget how many years we averaged, 16 to 21. So 5 years of data, that thing was consistently over the chronic standard. And look at all the other monitoring wells. We're showing that there is some level of groundwater impact. Jurisdictionally, do we typically monitor groundwater with respect to stormwater impacts under like the NIPD's multi-sector general permit, MSGP, for those of you familiar with nerdy jurisdictional talk? We don't. We're definitely having an impact there, and where does groundwater end up? It's base flow for streams and rivers. So this isn't a good situation. We're gonna get into the continuous data. Again, this is 18-19. We'll show you 2023 in a second. But notice here, we've got our seep kind of in that reddish, red color. Again, you see it's over the acute standard. It's never below the chronic standard. This is continuous data. So this is conductivity data monitored every 15 minutes, basically whenever it wasn't freezing over the course of seasons. So you'll see there's fluctuation. That makes sense. As rain occurs, we get dilution sometimes. As dry periods continue, we'll actually get an elevation in chloride levels. Seasonally, we do see a lot of spring wash-off of accumulated chloride from the winter, and then it abates throughout the summer, and then in the fall, it tends to sort of level off a little bit. Notice the pond outlet. Again, there's a lot of discontinuity of this data, equipment malfunctions, dry flow periods, that sort of thing. But again, we're pretty much above the chronic standard at all times, and this is over the course of a couple of years. If we fast forward to 2020, 2023, we're looking at similar patterns again. So you can see that seasonal fluctuation. You see those like that high spring wash-off. So salt accumulates through the winter. We get our spring rains. The ground thaws, importantly for the seep site, right? We're not going to see as much chloride when the ground is frozen. Water's not going into the ground. Once it thaws, there's all that salt sitting on the ground. We're probably going to get an elevation in chloride, and that is typically what we see in the springtime. You notice that the seep is lower. Again, we think that's because they did a few things at the site, such as adding a roof over that offloading pit, which we think probably had an impact on whatever salt was spilled on that pervious rail ballast, not being as impacted by rain. There's a concrete offloading pit where a lot of the spilled salt accumulates, turns into a nasty, briny slurry, which gets pumped out by a wastewater operator. Things like that. Maybe they reduce their practices as far as sweeping and tracking. It's hard to know. But we do see a slight decrease in that. However, the pond outlet, which is, again, where most of the water goes, is still seeing levels far above. And again, like those, I didn't explain this in the last slide, but down below we have a couple of control points. We actually added one to this one, control 2. We had some issues with control 1 drying up. But what that story tells is essentially we're low all the time. We're below the chronic standard. We're actually quite low, usually below 50 milligrams per liter and usually even less. there's just a quick comparison of that. And so again, just to highlight, you see that control site along the bottom in gray, always below the chronic standard, very low. Seep and pond outlet, generally above standards. And again, this is every 15 minutes whenever it's not freezing. So we really have a robust data set here. Our results for the soil samples, let's see. I had notes. This is usually Becky's part. So she's like, got this dialed. So you're getting the pinch hitter here. Oh, right, okay. So we did a little bit of soil sampling at each of these sites. So again, we have the control on the far left, the seep is in the middle, the pond outlet is on the right for all of these different ions. So chloride, sodium, magnesium, and potassium are the ions that we sampled. Chloride and sodium, unsurprisingly maybe, are relatively high. Notice the control site, not super high. That's what we'd expect. We don't expect to see a lot of chloride in an unimpacted watershed. Maybe a little sodium, maybe that's resident in the soil, the natural soils. But seeing high chloride at the seep and pond outlet isn't surprising. We do notice that we have a little bit less sodium at the seep site. We think that's because actually sodium gets bound to soil particles on its journey into that seep, whereas chloride is very mobile. It's not going to get bound. So we are seeing that come out at the seep. Again, at the pond outlet, we're seeing a lot of sodium pass through that pond. Water isn't going to provide a whole lot of opportunity for sodium to bind. So, for that, you need a soil medium. So that's kind of why we're seeing that export. Magnesium, kind of high across the board, even in control. We think it's just a natural part of the soil constituents in that area. And potassium is very low. Again, they're not storing potassium or magnesium on that site. So I guess this is relatively unsurprising. Caveat, neither one of us are soil scientists. And so these are results that we're sort of interpreting from a water quality standpoint. We did some additional soil sampling. So we actually tried, this is the outlet of this is the pond outlet outflow area. We were trying to determine if there was some sort of plume that could be determined using all of these points. And so we essentially took soil samples at different locations and depths to try and determine if we were seeing some sort of impact to cation exchange capacity within these wetland soils. What we found was that we don't really know enough about what's going on here and soil science in general to really adequately characterize this. So if you want to ask me questions about this and really grill me and watch me sweat, ask me questions about this. Because I don't know what's going on. We weren't really able to determine it. Again, we're seeing a lot of magnesium even far away. We see less near the pond outlet and more far away. Does that indicate leaching by this effluent from the stormwater pond? Potentially. Because remember, we saw relatively high magnesium concentrations in our initial soil samples. These samples were done later in 2021. So yeah, maybe we're actually seeing that sodium and chloride laden water leaching magnesium from the natural soil chemistry near the pond and not farther away. Calcium, kind of the same thing. But again, don't ask me questions on this. You'll really make me sweat. Okay, vegetation samples. So we sampled hemlock needles, and why did we sample hemlock needles? I'll show you some pictures next that'll explain why we did that. But essentially what we're seeing here, again, control seep pond outlet right across the line. Control site, not a lot of chloride concentration in the hemlock needles. At the seep site, again, very high concentration. So we've got something going on where we've got chloride going into that groundwater. Maybe we're seeing increased uptake in the vegetation through groundwater. It's not quite as high in the pond outlets, but still fairly high. So if you notice our concentration in milligrams per kilogram, we're looking at 4,000 to 8,000 for the pond outlet. There's no jurisdictional standard for this. There's no acute or chronic threshold here. It's just of note that our control site, which is a natural site, is much lower, whereas this site that's been developed appears to have some level of impact. And so again, why do we choose hemlock? Well, this is what we started to see over the course of the years we were out there. So keep in mind we were out there from, the site went in 2016. We started monitoring in 2018. And we had people there pretty much all the time, bi-weekly or monthly for 6 years. And we noticed that hemlock started dying. And so we took pictures of that. And then we said, well, why don't we sample it? Because a picture isn't always worth 1,000 words. Perhaps some data would be worth 1,000 words. So we got some data, but this is what prompted it. This is the seep site. So again, remember we talked about the seep coming out the bottom of that. It's kind of at the toe of a slope. Basically, there's a big sand lens on top of a clay layer, and then there's the river. And so this is where the seep is, and this is what we're seeing as far as hemlock there. So conclusions, gosh, I'm on time. It's the first time in my life. So salt loading to the wetland exceeds state and federal freshwater standards. That's what we're seeing across the board. Or salt concentrations rather, not necessarily loading. It's not a loading standard, misspoke. Soil concentrations of sodium indicate possible cation exchange. So there's some indication that we're changing native soil chemistry. That's gonna have an impact on vegetation. That's gonna have an impact on birds and bees and all kinds of macroinvertebrates that I also don't understand the life cycles of. Current modeling and monitoring methods by the permittee are inadequate to characterize pollution movement from the site. Remember, we talked about how those sites were far downstream. In the near decade that they've been operating, they've never showed an exceedance of the standard at those sites. And that's sort of a, well, obviously moment, because it's a monitoring point that's a kilometer downstream that has a massive watershed above it with a ton of impact. You're seeing so much dilution that there's no signal from that noise. And so forget about it. Of course you're not going to see an impact. So it doesn't even really pass the straight face test as far as a monitoring location. So improved monitoring methods are needed to measure the impact and prevent harm. The other thing I think that is of note here, and this kind of follows on the site design considerations talk, is that this is a modern facility. This was built in 2016. It's covered. It's using some level of MSGP management practices. It's got a stormwater pond, which is doing virtually nothing to prevent chloride from getting into the wetland. So if we're going to continue permitting sites like this, we need to think about our stormwater management practices. And frankly, like a stormwater pond, which just isn't going to allow chloride to pass through without doing anything for salt. I mean, you have to do reverse osmosis filtration or evaporation to actually get salt out of water. A pond is just like a glass of water. You're dumping salty water out. It's not doing anything. So you need effective control structures to prevent harm. So that's kind of the moral of the story. The monitoring isn't working, and neither are the management practices. And it's kind of sad, because this is a class 1 wetland. This is a special wetland in Vermont, so we need to do better than this. Our next study is on municipal sites. We basically want to find out, are municipal sites in Vermont kind of the same as this site? Are they exporting salt? I'll tell you that from one brief season of monitoring thus far, we're seeing an order of magnitude difference between up and downstream points at some of these municipal facilities, and they're just salt and sand piles that are uncovered. So not even rock salt, but just salt and sand. So nowhere near the concentration, we're seeing order of magnitude difference between up and downstream. So with that, I think I'm done.
Questions?
Can you hear me? Hi, thanks. I'm Ronnie Tanguay from the Connecticut DEP. So I'm working on salt in groundwater. I was curious, as you're starting to look into the municipal salt shed or salt piles, is there any consideration for looking at any private wells that might be around the area and potential impacts there to see what it's doing to the groundwater? Because we're seeing that prevalently in Connecticut.
Near and dear to my heart right there. We've tried to get a study going for a little while. There are some studies in Vermont that have looked at that. My next talk, at whenever it is about mapping wells in proximity to municipal salt storage facilities in Vermont. Have we tested anything? No. DOH, Department of Health in Vermont, does have testing for a lot of wells. It's all facultative testing, so just people getting their water tested out of curiosity. And so then your kind of shotgun scatter approach to like what wells are near roads, and are those wells different than wells that aren't? So there does seem to be some data out there. There does seem to be some impact as far as like wells in proximity to muni facilities or other facilities. We didn't even have a database of those facilities until we created it a couple years ago. So we're just in the beginning phase of like figuring that out. So great question, data TBD. Anyone have any money for that study? Talk to me and Chris Stepanuck.
Am I on? Yes. I'm Claudia Bramer, Protect the Adirondacks. I noticed that you said that the water standards were above the EPA limit of 230. And I'm wondering if the permitting agency took any sort of enforcement action, tried to, modify the permit or require them to do any other, best management practices, although you said that wasn't really working, even though it was a modern site. So wondering if they stepped in, given the data showing what you found.
The sticky wicket in this situation is that this is a federal rail facility, and they largely claimed exemption from state stormwater permitting as well as federal NIPD's permitting. And so they did do stormwater management practices, but they did it as a goodwill gesture and not necessarily as a regulated effort. And so even though there's evidence of exceedance, there's formally not really a stormwater permit. They do, I believe, have an MSGP, but enforcement of it is sparse. And so it's tough because, again, it's a federal rail facility, or they're claiming federal rail exemption. So there's a whole story behind that, which we probably don't have time for because now I'm over time. And Chris is standing there. Thank you.
Dana, great job.
Cheers. Thanks.
Appreciate it. Dana will be around. We're not letting him leave, so great job, Dana. Thank you. Our next presenter is Dr. Brendan Wiltse. Brendan is known to many of us for his long work and list of research and protection work in the park, from the Ausable River Association to the Adirondack Watershed Institute, where he's now the executive director. But perhaps his most interesting work is in his photography, where now his work is dedicated to helping shelter dogs by capturing professional photographs of them to help tell their stories. Magnificent work. So Brendan truly makes this world a better place. Please welcome Dr. Brendan Wiltse.
Thanks, Chris. I love dogs, as Chris said, but that's not what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll be talking about road salt in Mirror Lake, and in contrast to Dana's somewhat sobering and depressing presentation about the salt impacts on the environment, this, I think, is a positive story. Well, I know it's a positive story about what's been happening here on Mirror Lake in the village of Lake Placid. Mayor Devlin could come up and give this presentation if he wanted, but I'm gonna stand up here and give it instead. So Mirror Lake is just out the front door of this building. This is an aerial view of Mirror Lake and its watershed. The watershed goes sort of to the top of the hill above Main Street, which is on the left side of this image, back behind the Mirror Lake Inn, up Mount Whitney and Cobble Hill, which are off to the right, and then back down to the lake outlet, which is down in the bottom right of the screen. And what's unique about Mirror Lake is 27% of that area is developed. And if the lake is a big portion of that, if we take that out of the calculus, it's 34% of the land area of the watershed is developed. And this classifies Mirror Lake as an urban lake. And there's some irony in that, because if you look out in the distance beyond the watershed, it's surrounded by state protected wilderness area. So we have this little urban lake surrounded by these large wilderness areas. And of course, with development of any type, we have impermeable surfaces, sidewalks, roads, parking lots, driveways. And for a very long time in the Mirror Lake watershed, we were maintaining those surfaces, or a lot of those surfaces, free of snow and ice by using road salt or a sand salt mix. And we've been doing this for decades on Mirror Lake. And that runoff that comes off of those surfaces for a long time ran directly to the lake through more than 20 stormwater outfalls. So the grate that you saw on the street, that went into a pipe that went directly to the lake. And we've monitored the stormwater coming into the lake a number of different time periods over the last 10 years. And we've done this in close collaboration with the AuSable Freshwater Center. And we found concentrations coming out of the stormwater system as high as 12,000 milligrams per liter of chloride. And if you don't work with chloride concentration data, that number probably doesn't mean very much to you, but this is several times higher than both the acute and chronic toxicity thresholds for aquatic life set by the EPA. And to give a point of reference, in Adirondack lakes and streams that are not impacted by salt, the median concentration is 0.24 milligrams per liter, and sort of the range is up to 1. So this is many thousands of times higher than what we would expect to see flowing into an Adirondack lake. And we've been doing this, as I said, we've been doing this for many decades, and so this figure here shows the long-term trends in the mean annual concentrations, both in the surface and bottom of Mirror Lake, and they've been marching upwards for several decades. Back in 1974, the surface water concentration of Mirror Lake was 4 milligrams per liter. And so that we would still classify that as slightly elevated above what we would expect to find in an Adirondack lake. When we started work on Mirror Lake in 2015, the concentrations were sort of the upper 40s, lower 50 milligram per liter concentrations in the lake. And so this, again, if we can compare that to lakes that are not impacted by salt in the park, is many hundreds of times higher than what we would expect to see in Mirror Lake. So this figure is a bit complicated to wrap your mind around initially, but I'm going to reference it a few times throughout this slide. We've been monitoring the lake with intense detail since May of 2015. We go out with our partners at the AuSable Freshwater Center every 2 weeks, all year long, on the ice in the wintertime, and we're out there when the Ironman races are going on in the summertime and all other times of year. And the way you read this figure is the top of the figure is the top of the lake, the bottom is the bottom of the lake, and we have time going left to right, and the color that you see represents the chloride concentration at that particular depth and time. And the thing that I really want to point out is when we started this work, what we were seeing is this accumulation of chloride at the bottom of the lake in the wintertime. We'd get over 100 milligrams per liter at the lake bottom. And as Art Devlin mentioned in his opening remarks, the analogy I like to use to explain what's happening in the lake when this occurs is it's like Italian salad dressing. We had this salty, more dense layer at the bottom of the lake and a less salty, less dense layer above. And just like with your Italian salad dressing, unless you're kind of got some weird things going on with your eating habits, you probably want to mix that salad dressing up before you apply it to your salad. So you have to vigorously shake the bottle to put energy into that system to mix those two liquids of different density. And the same thing has to happen in Mirror Lake to mix that water column. And that additional energy that's required to mix the lake just isn't there or wasn't there for Mirror Lake for many years. And the lake would not completely mix, and we'd see those chloride concentrations persist at this high concentration through the summer, and the lake would finally mix in the fall. And this was impacting the oxygen concentrations in the lake. It was releasing nutrients from the lake, the sediments in the lake bottom, potentially impacting habitat for lake trout. There was a lot of concerns about this. We published a paper on this in the peer-reviewed literature in 2019. This made Mirror Lake one of 8 lakes in the country that have had this type of interruption in its natural mixing process documented in the scientific literature. And that was a designation I'm sure the Lake Placid community really wasn't happy to have about their lake that's right in downtown Lake Placid. And just around this time, we had been talking to the Lake Placid community for the previous 4 years about what we were seeing in the lake. And we also sort of had this culmination of a lot of things happen going into the 2019-2020 season where the Lake Placid community started implementing a number of best management practices around Mirror Lake. So Mayor Devlin mentioned some of these. I'm going to run through more of the municipal side of what was going on, but I also want to acknowledge that there was a lot of private landowners, homeowners, businesses that were doing incredible things as well. Mirror Lake Inn heats all of their sidewalk surfaces on their property. The sidewalk in front of this building is heated as well. Many other hotels and businesses, the Golden Arrow Lakeside Resort, were changing their practices along the way. But the village, one of the things that we determined early on is that the sidewalks were likely a very large source of salt for Mirror Lake. There's more municipal sidewalk surface in the Mirror Lake watershed than there is state road surface, which is another surface that's receiving straight sodium chloride application. So the village of Lake Placid uses a sweeper, which is more efficient at conforming to that those uneven sidewalk surfaces, especially the pavers that they have. As the mayor mentioned in his opening remarks, they used to use drop spreaders that would throw the salt into the front doors of the businesses along Main Street and out into the state road. And so they switched to a drop spreader. And then they also made operational changes to focus more on the mechanical removal of salt during the storm. So more sweeping during storm events, less material application, and then really using that material application towards the end of the event to clean up those surfaces after the event had passed. On the roads, the town of North Elba early on purchased a live edge plow out of their own operational budget. And then a grant from the Lake Champlain Basin Program paid for 2 additional road-conforming plows. They're not the Live Edge brand, but a different manufacturer. The town and village also let us track their salt use for 2 years as part of a research study. And that included not only their big plow trucks, but a smaller truck and the sidewalk sweeper, so that we could see where and how much salt was being applied within the watershed. And then the town of North Elba established a low salt zone across the north end of the lake where their section of road is. And they focused most of their material application at intersections and curves on the road and reduced their application along the straight sections of road that were less critical from a safety perspective. And then the village of Lake Placid, sort of concurrent to all of this, needed to upgrade their infrastructure along Main Street. Their water and sewer lines, I believe, are over 100 years old. And since they were ripping up Main Street, they also looked at the stormwater system. And we helped advise and guide the design of that system. So there's 4 large underground retention basins that receive stormwater runoff from Main Street, Lake Placid. They added permeable pavement in a number of their parking lots and other areas. And then pre-existing this large project, there were 14 stormwater outfalls along the eastern side of Mirror Lake that in 2017 they diverted to the Lake Placid Club golf course property. We happened to be undergoing a 2-year research project looking at the salt load to Mirror Lake when the village finally got all the funding in place to do the stormwater system. We didn't plan this, but it ended up working out really nicely. And so we had installed in 2 of those 20 stormwater outfalls conductivity loggers to look at the amount of salt coming through the stormwater system. Conductivity is, you can think of as a surrogate for salt. And so I pointed them out in this map. The top panel is from an outfall that is along the north end of the lake that drains Village Road and local businesses and homes. And then the bottom panel is at the bottom of Saranac Ave that drains local roads, businesses, homes, and State Road as well. And these panels show the salt concentrations the conductivity over a 2-year period, and you can see we have these big spikes. If you just compare the first half of each figure, we saw larger and higher concentrations coming from that bottom stormwater outfall. And in fact, the concentrations were so high that the data logger couldn't read the conductivity. We should have put a seawater calibrated data logger in there, but at the time we didn't really know what the maximum was going to be. So those figures, those spikes actually would go up above the other figure above it based on some of our discrete sampling that we've done. But what I really want to point out is the second half of each of these figures. The bottom stormwater outfall was incorporated as part of the green infrastructure and stormwater upgrades on Main Street. And you notice that there aren't really many spikes at all after that infrastructure went in 2021. And so this is great evidence of the effectiveness of that infrastructure to reduce the really high concentration discharges going directly to the lake. So looking back at this figure here, I put some benchmarks on here, sort of time horizons of how all of this unfolded on Mirror Lake over the last roughly 4 years. So in 2019 to 2020 is when the town and village really started implementing a lot of the best management practices that you're hearing about today at this event. And if you look after that, at the bottom of the figure, we don't see as bright of yellow coloring in that figure. There was less salt accumulating at the lake bottom after just one season of them beginning to implement these practices. If you go over the next year, around where it says 2021, it goes down even further, just based on the best management practices that were implemented. In the early summer of 2021, the stormwater infrastructure work started. It took 2 seasons to complete, and so it was finished in the fall of 2023. And by the winter of 2022-23, you see almost no additional salt accumulation at the bottom of Mirror Lake. So when we set out on this project back in 2015, we were really getting into the work sort of in 2017, 2018. We set 3 goals for Mirror Lake for the community. One was to restore the natural mixing regime of Mirror Lake. The second was to get the lake-wide chloride concentration below 40 milligrams per liter, because that was a number that was sort of surfacing in the scientific literature as being most protective of lakes like ours. And then sort of the stretch goal is to get it down to 10 milligrams per liter, which is another number that surfaced in the scientific literature as ecologically relevant. Those numbers are also in the Adirondack Road Salt Reduction Task Force report as recommendations. And so when we look at this, we have restored the turnover of Mirror Lake to what it would naturally be. We've achieved that first goal. So we see that reduction in chloride at the lake bottom. This is the same data just presented in a simpler way, maybe easier to understand. This is the total mass of chloride in Mirror Lake over this time period. So we're taking the concentration data from throughout the water column and combining it with the volume of water throughout the lake to calculate this. The line you see through there is a model that describes the long-term trends in the data. The red section is where the model was confident we were in a period of long-term increase, and the blue is a period of long-term decline. On the left half of the figure, you'll notice we get these big spikes. And if you could kind of map them down to the timeline below, that's during the winter time when we were applying salt to the watershed. On the right half of the figure, you see that those spikes are pretty much cut off. We don't see significant accumulation of salt in Mirror Lake in the wintertime over the last 4 years. And again, if we put those time markers on of the best management practices and the stormwater infrastructure going in around Mirror Lake, we saw the lake start to decline in its chloride concentration immediately upon the implementation of those best management practices. And this is something that we predicted in the paper we published, and our scientific reviewers challenged us on, and we told them, nope, we know this lake, we know what it's doing, and if these practices are put in place, the lake will respond quickly. And they were, and it did. And then when the stormwater infrastructure went in place, you see the slope of that line start going down even faster. And so we're seeing the combined effects of both the best management practices on the road and sidewalk surfaces and the stormwater contributing to the recovery of Mirror Lake. So this is the same data and same figure, just scaled differently. And I've put on these benchmarks of how much salt would need to be in the lake to hit these lake-wide average concentrations. And so in 2023, the lake stayed below a lake-wide average concentration of 40 milligrams per liter. So not only have we restored the mixing of the lake, we've also hit that second goal of getting the concentrations below 40 milligrams per liter. I put the benchmark for the 10 milligrams per liter on there as well. We're hoping that decline continues and we get close to 10 milligrams per liter. The mayor asked me recently, do I think it's possible? And I said, it's going to be challenging, but if you all want to do it, I think he can do it. And if they were to get Mirror Lake down to that concentration, it would be an enormous success story of what's possible by implementing the practices that we're hearing about today. And then the green line I put on there, just as a reference, that's where Mirror Lake, where we would expect it to be, absent of any salt application in the watershed. So a couple of take-home messages. The first is that road salt can reduce or inhibit the mixing of our lakes. And this is a really substantial alteration to the ecology and the physics of our lakes and aquatic ecosystems. And not only, we knew this before the work that we did, but we now know that we can actually have this happen here in the Adirondacks on certain water bodies like Mirror Lake. The second is that road salt best management practices work. And I guess I'll say this in context of work in terms of the environmental benefits of implementing these practices. The data is very clear. We saw the lake respond in a positive manner before the stormwater infrastructure went into place. So we know that the success that we're seeing isn't just because we started diverting a lot of the Main Street runoff away from Lake Placid. It's the best management practices are playing an important role in that. We also know that green infrastructure can mediate high concentration discharge to our water bodies. So we saw that in the conductivity logger data that I showed. And then we also see it in the lake where we see these concentrations continuing to decline after that stormwater system was put in place. And the last point is that long-term monitoring can help guide and inspire local watershed protection. Totally biased, I'm a scientist that believes in monitoring. But I think this is a great story where you heard the mayor come up here and tell you most of what I just told you. He understands the data, the community understands what's going on, they're supporting the long-term monitoring of the lake, and that improved understanding of Mirror Lake is helping to drive and inspire them to take action. And now that data is helping to show them that the things that they've been doing and the investments that they've been making are successful, and we're seeing success in Mirror Lake, and they want to go further. They want to see that trend line continue to go down for Mirror Lake. And it also allows us to share the success, document that, to share with all of you and other lakes and other communities that the things that we're talking about here today are effective at protecting the environment and can help reduce the chloride concentrations in our lakes and our streams. So I want to end just by acknowledging that this work has really been a community effort with a lot of different organizations that have supported it over the years. The Ausable River Association, now the Ausable Freshwater Center, the Mirror Lake Watershed Association, the Village of Lake Placid and Town of North Elba. I want to sort of acknowledge them specifically in their role in this. And we've received support from a lot of other organizations to support the work on Mirror Lake over the years, and also want to recognize the Lake Champlain Basin Program, who's funded a lot of the monitoring and science over the last 4 years on Mirror Lake. And with that, I believe I have a couple minutes, and I'm happy to take questions.
One point I'd like to say before we go to questions, when we do our science work, it's very hard to convey that message, and that analogy with the salad dressing is just one of the best analogies. It's so tough to take these science points and data and actually tell the story, so that's great. So a couple questions before break.
Hello, I'm Carson Clonan with the State Weather Center. So you said 2019, 2020 was when salt use started being reduced. The past 2 winters, that being 2022 to 2024, have been pretty mild with less than average snowfall in this area. I was wondering if you have any information on salt use in relation to yearly snowfall totals or seasonal averages, temperatures or something.
Yeah, that's a great question. We have done that, didn't have space to fit that figure into this presentation. So I don't know how easy it is to go back to the colorful figure, if anyone can reverse the slides. Maybe not, but there was one winter that really stood out as being substantially different, and that was 15-16. I think we were less than half the climate normal on snowfall for that year, and we saw significantly less salt accumulation. Go back a few more slides if you can. One more, maybe two more. There you go. So if you look in 2016, you'll notice the salt accumulation there is much lower, and we attribute that to a very mild winter. We have mapped this data and then the other slide I showed on top of the monthly snowfall totals for Lake Placid. We don't feel that the declines that we're seeing in salt concentration in Mirror Lake are being primarily driven by changes in snowfall and winter conditions.
You talked about the 10 milligrams per liter concentration lake-wide having importance for natural resource impacts. I may be stretching that a little bit, but I have read the report. Just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more, given the federal standard at 230. Like, that is magnitudes higher.
Right. I know the EPA is reevaluating the federal standard. I don't know the status of how far that is along. I would highly doubt they're going to put it at 10 milligrams per liter. That's really low. And that standard that they come up with is applicable to the entire country. Our systems are naturally more lower in chloride and arguably a bit more sensitive to it. The 10 milligrams per liter is where, in certain types of lakes, very similar to ours here in the Adirondacks, that you start to see impacts to the zooplankton population, certain species of them, which sit in the middle of the aquatic food web. And so there's concern if we start to impact them because they're food for fish, and they're also the things that eat all the plankton that make our lakes green and less clear. And so that's where that number comes from. And the 40 milligram per liter is also related in large part to them, but you start to see more significant changes in those communities at 40 milligrams per liter.
One more question.
Hi, my name is Marie. I'm a private contractor here in Lake Placid. I'm just wondering, is there a catch basin? Is there anything coming off of Beach Hill community in the north, like eastern, northeastern?
No, those, so that is north of the major diversion that occurred in 2017 that goes to the Lake Placid Club property. So there are 2 storm drains at the bottom of that road that go under Mirror Lake Drive and out to the lake. And we have done monitoring on those. I don't have the sort of data locked away in the top of my head.
And on that portion of Mirror Lake, they're using sand salt mix?
Yes.
Okay. So those are the slides I have later on.
Great.
For the panel.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite impressive.
Okay, I want to be mindful of our break, so we get a little time for break. So thank you, Brendan. Thank you, all the presenters in the morning. We will reconvene at 10:20, so 15-minute break. And thank you very much.